I wanted to bring in DeAnna Hoskins as well, the president of Just Leadership USA, which works to ensure people most affected by incarceration drive policy reform. Just Leadership will be hosting a program within the Democratic National Convention next week called Rebuilding the Table, their Just Us campaign calling on federal and state lawmakers to save the lives of incarcerated people by releasing them during the COVID pandemic. DeAnna Hoskins, as you watch Messiah's amazing documentary series, can you talk about how this can translate into policy and will very much determine whether the Democratic Party's platform looks different from the Republican Party's platform?
Yes, thank you, Amy. Watching Messiah's documentary was basically my life story of my son, having my son at 17, dealing with substance abuse. And exactly the things and the barriers that were actually demonstrated or talked about in his documentary are the realities. His mother recently getting clean and getting able to get her life together. And this was the situation 20 years ago when I returned. So nothing has changed around the barriers for women to reunite with their family. When we talk about policies, having worked on a policy level, funding always come into a state from HUD around emergency shelter, but places like Hope House, A New Way of Life, don't receive that funding because they're considered what we call transitional houses, and federal and local funds don't pay for transitional housing, which are the most needed housing for women, especially Black women returning from incarceration, where substance abuse and mental health has actually been one of our issues. So if we're going to start talking about policy, we're seeing where policymakers see the big picture, but they don't understand the intricate details such as what Messiah and his mom talked about. The charge kept being incarcerated or prosecuted. No one ever focused on the issue of what was driving to the crime that led to incarceration. And then for women, his mother says something so important that I think everyone forgets. Society expects a woman to take care of her children. So not only do we go incarcerated with substance abuse and mental health, we then have the shame and guilt that we have to overcome, which a lot of times continues to drive to our substance abuse. So even addressing the trauma that may have taken place during our active addiction, none of those things are actually woven into policy. It's always a Band-Aid issue. And that's why we're hosting this Rebuilding the Table. We're tired of Band-Aid solutions. We need real solutions that have real impact in our community, that impact and change the trajectory of our lives and our children. Because what we know, if we're going to break the cycle of addiction from generation, we have to give people a flat start to bounce from to be successful.
So what does it mean to be included in the Democratic convention next week? What are you going to say to the leaders there? By the way, Democracy Now! Will be covering the whole week and the highlights of the speeches at night, as well as bringing analysis. But DeAnna Hoskins.
So, Amy, one of the biggest things is we know Biden-Sanders unity table came up with criminal justice recommendations, and we applaud them for that. But the one thing that we actually want to bring to their attention is just what we're talking about. While their policies talk about the lack of housing, employment, health care for people returning to the community, they missed the boat of the intricate details of what led to that. They missed the intricate details of how do we start evaluating individuals based on possible trauma, substance abuse, mental health, when we are always incarcerating people. Does it have to be, when Messiah talked about the defund police concept, defunding police, we're saying the largest budget item in any state, any city is always corrections and law enforcement. We're saying with defund the police, divest from law enforcement and corrections and invest in our communities. Our communities are lacking substance abuse treatment. Our communities are lacking mental health substances issues. So we have to talk about that. Messiah talked about the clinic. And those clinics are underfunded because they're not a budget line item in the city's budget. But we have to take from the over-enforcement to cure social ills where this community has lacked the resources, especially in Black and brown marginalized communities. So our reason for being at the table, you're missing a boat. And if you want to do something different, You have to have our voices at the table when you draft policy, not after you draft it for us to carry it. We have to be in the design of the policy. And we know you understand people being directly impacted, being at the table, because your immigration table had individuals from that community. When you talk about veterans, you have veterans at the table. When you talk about the Disabilities Act, you have people with disabilities at the table. I need Democrats to understand and actually look within themselves. What is their implicit bias that we don't have the expertise to sit at the table?